Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the 16th President of the George Washington University, Dr. Stephen Knapp.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's lecture by former Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, Dr. David Kessler, who will be focusing on his very important book, not only an important book, actually a New York Times bestseller, and the book's title is The End of Overeating, and it examines the interactions between the foods we eat and the chemistry of the brain in ways that illuminate, I think in a variety of ways, the obesity epidemic currently plaguing the United States, which we've recently heard has leveled off, but by no means has subsided as an issue, and is something that we're very interested in working on here at this university. In fact, all the issues in Dr. Kessler's book are highly relevant to a wide range of our activities here at George Washington. We have an increasing number of cross-disciplinary courses in all our schools, including public health, education, medicine, and international affairs. And our students have been very intensely engaged in thinking about and advocating about food and food-related issues for a number of years now. One prominent example of that is our Food Justice Alliance, which maintains a community garden and donates all the food produced by that garden to a local soup kitchen, but also advocates for a range of issues, including stronger policies to benefit food workers. Several years ago, we launched the Urban Food Task Force, which has developed a number of initiatives, and I won't try to give you the whole spread of those, but just to pick out a couple of examples. One of those, the Integrated Food Project, which incorporates food-related examples into the high school curriculum, and that's something that we do in partnership, something that the Urban Food Task Force, which is chaired by Diane Robinson Knapp, started working on with the School Without Walls, engaging our faculty experts to work with the teachers at the School Without Walls, which for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is a public magnet school located right in the heart of our campus. And the idea was to take examples from food and use those in the instruction in a number of traditional fields, the sciences and mathematics and so on, languages, and begin to develop a curriculum built around food examples that would have two benefits. One, increasing students' interest in those subjects because everybody's interested in food, and so that would transfer to the intellectual excitement that would be generated around those subjects, but at the same time improve their eating choices, giving them more healthy eating options. And we're currently under the direction of Vice President Leo Chalupa, Vice President for Research. Our faculty members are exploring the possibility of creating a food institute that would provide a kind of umbrella for the many different activities across the university that focus on food and nutrition. Well, we're delighted to have Dr. Kessler join us this afternoon as part of our week-long celebration of Food Day, which I guess makes it Food Week. And it's my pleasure now to bring on to the podium to bring the person who will introduce Dr. Kessler, Dr. Lynn Goldman, who is the Dean of the School of Public Health and Health Services and Professor of Environmental and Occupational Health. Before coming to GW, she served on the faculty at Johns Hopkins University, and before that was Assistant Administrator for Toxic Substances at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, where she had many opportunities to work with Dr. Kessler in his role in a closely related agency. So, Dr. Goldman.
Thanks for that introduction, and welcome to all of you for our Food Day celebration. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. David Kessler. Dr. Kessler is actually a doctor 3 times over. He has his JD from the University of Chicago, an MD from Harvard University, and most importantly, an honorary doctorate from the George Washington University. And we once again welcome him here. Dr. Kessler has played an extremely important role in assuring that the public's health is protected, is safeguarded from a number of hazards. Currently a professor at UC San Francisco, he formerly was commissioner of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. And it's interesting to reflect in today's very partisan political climate that he served under both a Republican president, President George W. Bush, and a Democratic president, President Bill Clinton. I don't know if that could happen today. At FDA, Dr. Kessler was pioneer in a number of areas. Many of the reforms that you see underway today in how we regulate drugs, how we regulate food safety, were actually begun by Dr. Kessler. But I think one of the most important things that he achieved was the regulation of tobacco and tobacco products by the FDA. He was one of the first to bring to the nation's attention the fact that this is a public health threat that is deserving of control in the way that all public health hazards are controlled by health regulatory agencies. And in fact, it is through his efforts that we eventually wound up with legislation by Congress to establish at the FDA an authority to actually regulate the safety of tobacco and tobacco products. Truly a remarkable achievement. Well, today he's turned his focus largely to the issue of food and the problems that we have societally with a massive epidemic of obesity, not only in the United States, but also globally. And this is an extremely serious issue, and it's an extremely important issue. And interestingly, it's an issue that has many parallels to the problem of smoking. And that I think that you'll hear, as you hear Dr. Kessler speak, that same passion that he brought to safeguarding the public from the threats of tobacco and making sure that the pharmaceuticals on the marketplace were safe, and some of the work I did with him on food safety, you'll hear much of that passion from him today. But I also want to note how important it is that Dr. Kessler not only brings to these issues a sense of passion and advocacy, but a real respect and regard for the science that underlies the approaches that he takes, and for understanding the evidence and bringing that evidence to bear so that what we do can be more effective. So I very much look forward to hearing what David Kessler has to say with us today. Welcome to David. Please come forward.
So, thank you, Dean Goldman. We were colleagues, what's known as in the trade as agency heads, which really translates into, I think, as Lynn would say, I get a phone call. Dr. Goldman's on the phone, and the first words out of her mouth would be something like, "We have a problem." So that's what happens when you run these government agencies. But they're really, they're enormous privileges. It's like white heat. I'll just tell you one story. The nutrition facts panel? On the food label, when you pick up that bag of M&Ms and you see it has like 50% of your daily value of fat or whatever it is, and you put it back, that was sort of our fault, that label. And it almost didn't happen. Let me just tell you the story of how how policy really gets made. We worked very hard. How do you convey information in a very small amount of space that's useful to consumers? And one day, you know how the government works. We're here in Washington. This is the test, right? So a pizza is regulated by whom? What agency? Who regulates a pizza? A pizza, cheese pizza, FDA. If you add pepperoni to it, USDA. Go figure. Okay. So so we wanted to do the food label for all of packaged foods, which include processed foods, both regulated by FDA and by USDA. And the Secretary of Agriculture one day said to me, "I don't like the label." And why didn't he like the label? Because his products had higher fat content and wouldn't make his products necessarily look good. And he said, "I'm going to take this issue to the president." I said, "You're what?" Right? So fast forward into the Oval Office. There was George Bush, the father, right? There was Dan Quayle, the vice president. There was James Baker, who had been Secretary of State. Marlin Fitzwater, the press secretary, to the president. There was Secretary of Health and Human Services, Secretary of USDA, 6 guys who've never cooked in their lives deciding the fate of the food label. And I had been with the kids, you know, McDonald's has tray liners, right? So we'd worked with McDonald's to get the nutrition facts information onto the tray liner. And when the Secretary of Agriculture said, Mr. President, FDA lost its mind, it's not going to make all the food industry change all products, we take out the tray liner and hand it to the president and say, Mr. President, if it's good enough for McDonald's, it should be good enough for the Department of Agriculture. The president's sitting there and looking at the tray liner. All these guys are looking at this McDonald's tray liner. The president goes, well, if it's good enough for McDonald's, I guess it's good enough for the Department of Agriculture. And that's how policy gets made in this country. Fast forward, I had the privilege of going to Yale as dean of the medical school. I'm sitting there with a group of residents and fellows. You know, we had done tobacco, Lynn talked about, we did food labeling, but asking a very different question. Nothing to do with food, but a question to do, if you really want to stay alive, what can you do? What do we know about prevention? And that was the question. And I mean, I know what you're going to die of. I mean, 3/4 of us are going to die of either heart disease or cancer or stroke. And I was very interested in what we know about prevention of those 3 diseases. And what's the evidence base of those 3 diseases? And the librarian at Yale, this was before everything was online, was helping me pull all the prevention articles, and I noticed something. Right? I noticed that that as she was pulling all the articles on cardiac disease, on cancer, and on stroke, she had lost 30 pounds. As she was reading all these articles, what she realized over a 3-month period, I said, why did you lose this weight? She said, I've been studying all these major killers, and I realized that at the center of those diseases, right, really at the core, is excess energy in your body, and it plays really a crucial role that really a whole host of major diseases it contributes to. So that got me interested in the issue of obesity. This is about a decade ago. And I just wanted to get a handle on it. I wanted to understand something about weight and obesity and about eating. So I called up my friend Catherine Flegel, one of the great epidemiologists at the Center for Disease Control. And I just asked a very simple question. I said, explain to me how weight has changed over our lifetime. So when I was growing up as a kid in the 50s and 60s, what was adult weight like? So she sent me this graph, and the epidemiologists in the room will never graph things like this, but she's one of the great epidemiologists, so she's allowed to do this. This is weight this is when you're in your 20s. This is in your 30s, in your 40s, in your 50s, in your 60s. And this is just weight in kilograms, so double it for pounds. So here's what weight looked like, I mean, in the first NHANES data, the first data survey back taken in the 1960s. So you entered your 20s, you gained a few pounds between your 20s and your 40s, weight was relatively flat, and then you lost a few pounds. That was in the 1960s. That was in the 1970s. That was in the 1990s. That was the 2000. So that's 4 decades, right? And what do you see? What's the difference in those curves? 10 kilograms. What?
10 kilograms.
10 kilograms, which is 20 pounds. And what do you see? What's changed? It can't be genes, because genes don't change in 4 decades. So something's going on, and what do those graphs show you?
The incline is steeper, and towards the end of their life, they're not losing as much weight.
Exactly, which is a great observation, right? So you see weight continues. You continue to gain weight later on, right, through your adult years. So you don't plateau here in your 30s, you continue to gain weight until your early 50s, your late 40s, right? But there's also another change. What's the other change that you see in these graphs? What is it? You start out heavier. So where does the problem begin? You enter your adult years 18 pounds heavier. So where's the problem? Exactly. So the problem is before this, right? So you enter your adult years 18, 20 pounds heavier. So I was very interested in what was going on that resulted in those graphs. That was the first question. Why did that happen? Second question. I was watching, I will admit, it was late at night. I was watching the daily rerun of the Oprah show. And there was a Dr. Phil segment. Don't get me started on Dr. Phil. And he brings up to the stage, he brings up a woman, and I still remember her, very well educated, very sophisticated, very smart, right? Clearly very successful. And she says, I eat after my husband goes off to work in the morning. I eat before he comes home at night. I eat when I'm happy. I eat when I'm sad. I eat when I'm hungry. I eat when I'm not hungry. And then she looked in the camera and said, and I don't like myself. So why was this woman doing what she didn't want to be doing, but she was doing anyway? What was driving this woman to do? She was very successful, but she was doing something she didn't want to be doing. What was going on? So the two questions I have, next half hour, I want to answer those questions. What's driving these curves? And why was this woman doing what she didn't want to be doing, but she was doing anyway? Right? Now I'm going to give you 5 pieces of science. Those of you who aren't scientists, I will not lose you, I promise. So follow me, and we'll try to answer those 2 questions. What's happened in the last 4 decades, and why was this woman doing what she didn't want to be doing? When we were in med school, right, we learned about something called a set point. Anyone ever hear the term set point? Right? What's a set point? What's a set point?
It's a mechanism in your brain that sets your weight at a certain level and maintains it over many different kinds.
So I'm born with it?
I think so.
So I'm born with this thing, and it's in my brain, and it's if I lose weight, the reason why I gain it back is because there's a body has a set point. And where is the set point exactly?
Hypothalamus.
Hypothalamus. And you're sure we have it?
A lot of evidence shows it.
A lot of evidence here, okay. But the problem is we're getting bigger and bigger, right? So certainly if we're getting bigger and bigger, there can't be a set point that's protecting our weight, that sets us at a certain weight. So something is going on that allows us to override that set point. Let me give you the first hypothesis, okay? In the presence of a varied and limitless diet, varied and limitless, people and animals will tend to eat excessively. If I give you a varied amount of food and it's limitless, you'll eat excessively. What's the evidence for that? This is the most simple of experiments, okay? This is, you just take animals and you put them in a cage, right? It was done by Peter Rogers at Cambridge University, Tony Sclafani at Brooklyn College, and they identified what they call the American supermarket diet. And what was the American supermarket diet? You up here, you say it's bread, peanuts, and chocolate. So if you just take animals from birth, and just from early on, I mean, at birth, and you give them chow through their young years, you see this is their weight gain with chow. Add to that cage, just put in a varied and limitless diet of bread, peanuts, and chocolate, and you see that the animals, this is their weight gain. Take away that supermarket diet right here, and the weight comes back down. So just take the American supermarket diet, feed it in a varied and limitless way, and you see this explosion of weight. Second piece of science, right? I was very interested in wanting, the issue of wanting, not liking. What's the difference between wanting and liking? Let me come down there. What's the difference between wanting and liking? Liking is whether something gives me what? Pleasure. But what's wanting? Desire. There's a motivational component to it, right? So here we did a very simple experiment. We wanted to understand wanting, right? And how do you measure wanting? Right? You can measure wanting is really how hard an animal or a person will work for something, how hard they'll press a lever, right? So you make them press a lever once and they'll get the food, but then you make them work certain multiples 2 times or 4 times or 8 times or 64 times or 128, and you see whether they'll continue to work. You know, it's whether a person will go out and smoke in the cold, or whether they're willing to go out and drive, or I'm willing to pay $10 a cigarette. You have a sense of how much do I want it, right? So this is not the typical scientific title of a scientific article, right? Deconstructing the vanilla milkshake, right? So I wanted to know what was in a vanilla milkshake that drives wanting, right? So what's in a vanilla milkshake? There's sweetness, there's fat, and there's flavor, right? So how many think it's the sweetness in the vanilla milkshake that drives wanting? Raise your hands. About a third. How many think it's the fat? About a third. How many think it's flavor? About a third. How many think it's all 3? Well, of course, right? It's comfort. It's actually the sweetness. The sweetness is the main driver of wanting. But add to that sweetness fat, right? And it's synergistic. Let me give you another. I called up my colleague Gaetano Di Chieri. These are slides measuring certain areas of the brain. But the important part is Gaetano is one of the great pharmacologists. His work back in the 1980s really measured brain dopamine, right? What does dopamine do in the brain? Anyone know? It's involved in pleasure. That's actually the opioids. Dopamine's involved in attention, in learning. It gates our attention. It focuses us. And what Gaetano did, right, was, he found that amphetamine, cocaine, heroin, and morphine all elevate. Those are all what? Those are all drugs of abuse. And he found that all those drugs of abuse elevate brain dopamine. So this is something called, he's measuring it in called the nucleus accumbens shell of the rat. That's just a fancy neuroanatomical place, but it's the emotional core of the brain. And what Gaetano said is, look, those drugs of abuse will give us rises in brain dopamine each and every time we take it. Food will give you a little bump, but then it'll habituate. What do I mean by habituation? It goes away. Right? So I said, Gaetano, do me a favor. Take fat and sugar, right? Take that American supermarket diet and feed it repeatedly to animals. And if you don't, if you just feed it once, you'll get a little rise in brain dopamine, but second and third times, you don't. If you feed it repeatedly, if you condition the animals for weeks with fat and sugar, you get a rise of brain dopamine each and every time. The fact is, fat, sugar, and salt stimulate us, right, to eat more and more. I thought I was eating for satiation. I thought I was eating for nourishment, right? Thought I was eating for satisfaction. I didn't realize I was eating for stimulation. These are the brain circuits. I showed this. This is from the late work of the late Ann Kelly. These are the circuits in all of us, right, that are involved. They're all different, but they're involved in learning, memory, habit, and motivation. Right? And there probably are not circuits that are just designed for food. Now, why will a diet drug never work? Sure, a diet drug, I can give you amphetamine and you'll lose weight, but what circuits does that diet drug have to work on? Has to work on these circuits. And what do you use these circuits for? You use these for learning, memory, habit, and motivation. So I can get you to lose weight if I give you a drug and I occupy those circuits, but what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to give me back 5 IQ points, right? Because those circuits are not just, are they involved to function every day, to learn, to have memory, to habit, and motivation? Sure. So there's nothing that's unique about those circuits where I can just affect those circuits, just turn off desire for food and not turn off learning, etc. Last piece of science. I was very interested in that woman, right, on that Oprah show. I eat when I'm hungry, I eat when I'm not hungry. And if you're a doc or you're a clinician, right, what do you hear? What did you hear from that woman? She had what? She had an addiction. What did you actually hear? What were the elements of that? She had this sort of, how did she feel? She's needy. She felt that she was empty. She was eating to feel better. What's the definition, okay, of a reinforcer? What's the definition of a reward? Jerome Kagan, the great developmental biologist, taught me anything that could change how I feel really is a reward. But how did it make her feel? When she says, I eat when I'm hungry, I eat when I'm not hungry, what I heard was this sort of loss of control. She really didn't feel like she was in control. Sure, she was in control, but she felt there was something pulling. There was a lack of satiation, a hard time stopping. Once she started eating, she kept on going. And there was a preoccupation, a thinking about foods. You ever eating something, and you're thinking about what you're going to eat next, or you're thinking about something, there's that pizza box, and you're sitting with friends and family, and there's only one slice, and you're thinking whether I'm going to get that slice, right? So you have this woman who's talking about this hard time controlling her eating, this hard time stopping, this thinking about foods, and we developed scales, and we found people score very high. What we found is that 50% of people who are obese, 30% of people who are overweight, 25% of people who are a healthy weight score very high on those characteristics. Now, that may not sound like a lot, but 50% of obese, 30% of overweight, 25% of healthy weight, that's some 70 million Americans report a loss of control, a lack of satiation, a preoccupation. Right? So what is that? Those are elements of certainly a conditioned and driven, right? There's something motivating. There's something I feel that's pulling me. Last piece of science, okay? Because we were very interested in what is this constellation? Why do so many people feel that they have this loss of control, lack of satiation? So with my colleague, Dana Small, one of the great neuroimagers, we study people who score very high on these characteristics. Right? Now, there's some in this audience, right, who, when I talk about loss of control, hard time stopping, preoccupation, thinking about food, go, I have no idea what you're talking about. They can't relate at all to this. I gave a speech to the American Society of Bariatric Physicians. These are the docs who are involved in weight, not the surgeons, but the medicine folks who are involved in controlling weight. And I said, what percentage of your patients who have a hard time with their weight have those three characteristics? What do you think I heard from them? All of them. And then I said to them, what do you think that is driving that? What do you think I heard from the docs? All MDs, right? All trained. I said, what is that loss of control, lack of satiation, preoccupation? The answer I heard, we never thought about it. We only thought it was about metabolism. We thought about it was energy in, energy out. It was about calories. What is this loss of control? What is this lack of satiation? What is this preoccupation? All right, so first thing we have to establish in order to understand the experiment is where does the power of food come from? Power of food comes from somebody. Comes from taste or what's the difference? Taste is actually consumatory, right? But the smell is anticipatory, right? So one is, in essence, the anticipation. A smell is just a cue of something that I may end up tasting, right? So whenever I land at San Francisco Airport, when the plane hits the runway, I start thinking about these dumplings, right? The plane becomes, because there's these dumplings in the airport food court, And so the plane becomes a cue. Next time you get hungry, think about what's the cue. There's always a cue. Sometimes you get in the car and you start thinking about food, you're driving along, and you all of a sudden, because you've driven past someplace and you stopped and you had the food. So just remember Pavlov? Certain things become associated with certain things. Whenever you're hungry, there's a cue. Now, what we know in the human brain is the amygdala. And what's the amygdala? It's really the emotional core, but it's sort of our vigilance center. Something is different, right? Our amygdala gets activated. Now the fact is the amygdala in all of us gets activated in response to cues, because it really is our vigilance center, right? So everybody's amygdala gets activated with the response to cues, smell compared to the taste. But what we did is we took people who had this hard time controlling their eating, we put them in the fMRI magnets, we studied their brains, we just cued them with the smell of the chocolate milkshake. And what you see is that the amygdala, there's excessive activation, right? The anticipatory response is enhanced. It's sort of oversensitized, it's stimulated. There's greater activation of the amygdala in response to a cue, to a food cue, in people who have a hard time controlling their eating. And once people who have a hard time controlling their eating get the food, you see that the amygdala response, the emotional core, stays activated in those who have a hard time controlling the eating until all the food is gone. So there's a biological reason why people have a hard time controlling their eating. So if you're sitting here, if I'm, I had the privilege when I did the book going out and talking to audiences, right? And if you hear that, if you see that data that I just showed you, and you're sitting there at 350 pounds and you've had a hard time controlling your eating, what do you start thinking to yourself? What goes through your head? When I tell you there's a biological reason, you've always known there was this pull of food. You always knew there was a hard time controlling it. It's not my fault. That's exactly right. But just because it's not your fault, right, does that mean you can't take steps to protect yourself? But you now know what's going on. Your brain is being activated by those cues. Let's see if we can put this in a little bigger context. We are all wired, every one of us are wired to focus on the most salient stimuli in our environment. What do I mean by salient stimuli? If a bear walked in here right now, you'd stop listening to me, you'd focus on that bear. If you start smelling smoke, right, you start paying attention to that. Now, each of us may respond to different salient stimuli, but that amygdala in all of us is going to be activated by what we have, based on our past learning and past memory, have determined is most salient stimuli. What's happened in the last 4 decades? Highly palatable foods, right? What's highly palatable? Fat and sugar, fat and salt, fat, sugar, and salt have become hot stimuli. The food industry, has figured this out, and basically over the last 4 decades have created foods to be highly salient stimuli. The Washington Post outed me because I was going dumpster diving when I wrote the book. And so here's what's actually put inside, this is at Chili's, what was put inside the chicken. Not what it was cooked with. This is actually the liquids that were put, either they're injected into the chicken, or they are by these needles, or they sort of have these big cement mixers that vacuum suck the liquid into the chicken. This is before it's even cooked, right? So what's put inside the chicken? Orange juice, which is what? Lemon bar mix, triple sec, soybean oil, tequila, salt. Pick any appetizer. Pick any appetizer in a modern American restaurant. What's popular? Give me an appetizer. Nachos. Fries. Chicken wings. Right. Chicken wings. Take the chicken wing. What is it? You start off, the chicken wing is the fatty part of the chicken, right? You fry it. It's fried in the manufacturing plant. What does frying do? It pushes 30% fat into the chicken. That's when you fry it. 30% of the water leaves the chicken. Fry it again in the restaurant. That adds another 30% fat in. 30% of the water comes out. The red sauce is what? And that white creamy sauce on the side is what? And so what are we really eating? We're eating fat on fat on fat on sugar on fat, sugar, and salt. Right? So food has been designed to achieve a remarkable salience or prominence in our minds. Again, just let's make sure you all understand how this works. So we're all vulnerable to cues. A cue can be the sight. It could be the smell. It could be a sign. It could be just walking by a place that I went in. I mean, one day I was walking down Powell Street in San Francisco, and I started thinking about chocolate-covered pretzels, and I go, why did chocolate-covered pretzels all of a sudden come into my head? And I realized that 6 months earlier I had been into a place on that same street, just the location, right? So, but just being on that street was a cue, because we're such effective learners. Those cues, right, and stimuli create, the way it works is there's this arousal, there's this increased attention, right? There's these thoughts of wanting. There's this momentary bliss when I eat the food, right? Because I'm zoned out. I'm having a good time. Nothing else is getting through. My brain is being activated. 2 minutes later, what happens? I go, why did I just do that? The next time I'm cued, right? I strengthen the neural circuitry, and the behavior becomes, those cues activate the brain circuitry, and the behavior becomes what? There's an automaticity. It's rewarding, and it's self-sustaining. What caused those change? What happened that resulted in those 4 decades, in those graphs that I showed you? What happened? What's been the business plan of the modern global food company? Exactly, and where? But if you're in a food company, what have you wanted to do over the last couple of years? Okay, and how are you going to sell food? You're going to make it delicious. So what are you going to do? Okay, and okay, and so back in the 1920s and 1930s, in order to feed a hungry nation, right? The food industry learned to process foods. There's a lot of good about what does processing do? It sort of takes out the hydration, but there's a lot of advantages. Food becomes, you're able to ship it over long distances, longer shelf life, it becomes cheaper, you can put it in a box, you can put it in a package, it'll stay. Advantages to food safety. What did the food industry learn to do? When did it learn to dial over those decades? What did it learn to do to process foods? What did it learn to load and layer into that processed foods? And salt. And what does it also take out? What's the problem with processed foods? What does it take out? It takes out nutrients. What else does it take out? Fiber. And what does fiber actually do? But it slows your, I mean, processed food takes out anything that slows down, anything that's objectionable. Eat any processed foods. When, 20 years ago, how many times did we used to chew per bite? 20. And today, pick any processed food, how quickly does it go down? It goes down in a whoosh. So we're, in essence, what are we eating? We're eating baby food, right? Because we're just self-sustaining, that's loaded with fat, sugar, and salt. Now, if you're that food company, and you want to sell more food, and nothing wrong with that, right? That's your job as a company. What are you going to do? How are you going to make more money? What's the options? Make it easier to eat, okay? And what does that mean? Eat more. But how do you get people to eat more? When I was growing up as a kid, when did we used to eat? When did I used to eat? 3 times a day. When do you eat today? All the time. So what's your plan? What Taco Bell, the tagline, is what? Anyone know it? Fourth meal, right? It's brilliant. Why do they have a fourth meal? Because at the fourth meal, what are they going to do? You're going to eat again, and if they eat again, what happens? You're eating. Right. So I was invited to one of the big global food companies, right, to give a lecture. I showed these data, and they said, play us straight. I said, okay. And they said, let me give you an analogy. And you have to be careful with this analogy. But nicotine. Nicotine is a moderately reinforcing chemical. Rats will press a lever for it. But it's not the most addictive chemical, interestingly. But add to that nicotine, the smoke, the throat scratch, the cellophane crinkling of the pack, the image of the cowboy. Certainly in my parents' and my grandparents' generation, the sense that smoking was sexy, cool, glamorous. So what did we do? We took a reinforcing chemical, we added all these other levels of stimuli, and we made it into a highly addictive product. I give you a package of sugar and say, go have a good time. You're going to say, what are you talking about, Kessler? Okay? But now add to that sugar, add fat, add texture, add color, add temperature, add mouthfeel, add the emotional gloss of advertising. Say you can go do it with your friends, do it at the end of the day when you're tired, walk into any food court, go into Union Station, go downstairs, and what does it look like? It's a carnival, right? What did we think was going to happen in the last 4 decades? Is the problem the food, or is it the way my brain processes the food? Right?
Well, I had a question. Do you mean the food industry didn't know what was going on when they asked you that question? Like they don't, or...
What do you think the response was that I got, right? When I explained that what the food industry, the global food, the business plan has been to take fat, sugar, and salt, put it on every corner, make it available 24/7, make it socially acceptable to eat any time. They took down any boundaries. What do you think their response was? What do you think? Right? They want it. It was interesting. There was absolute silence in the room. Right? And then somebody said, everything that's made us successful as an industry is the problem.
But they use the word problem, so they know that it's an issue.
Those were their exact words. Why, up until recently, have the French not gotten fat? Food is healthier? They don't eat between meals. They don't eat in the streets. They don't eat, so they had certain boundaries, right? I mean, is fat and sugar, fat and salt new? No, my grandmother cooked with fat and sugar. But when did I eat it? And when did I have dessert? Occasionally. When do I have dessert now? All the time. So we've taken down all those boundaries. The real issue when McDonald's went to France wasn't the processed food necessarily, but the fact that it was open all the time. When do these circuits, which circuits are involved? This is key. Which circuits of our brains are involved in eating? The reward center, and those include what? That involves learning, memory, habit, and motivation. When does that circuitry get laid down? When does that, can we just go to the first slide? I just want to show, this is not a pitch for the book. Someone just put up the cover of the book. Because if you understand this cover, it was interesting. Again, I promise you, it wasn't meant as a pitch for the book, but it was done by the great graphic designer Chip Kidd. Right? Chip, there's books just about Chip's, with Chip's jacket covers. He's a great graphic designer. Now play me straight. Okay? When you look at this cover, and I didn't get this, but if you understand this cover, you understand the neuroscience of eating. What do you look at? What does your attention get grabbed by when you look at this? Raise your hand. How many of you it's the carrots? Raise your hand. Right? You're the ones I want to study. Right? Why does our attention get captured? When does that happen? The average 2-year-old child will compensate for their eating. What do I mean by that? You give them more calories at lunch, they'll eat fewer calories less in the day. By the time that the child has been exposed to the American supermarket diet, the American diet by 4 or 5, what happens? They lose the ability to compensate. So where does this learning and memory and sensitization of these circuits get laid down? When does it get laid down? What part of our lives? It gets laid down pretty young, right? And once they get laid down, as with alcohol, right? How long does that sensitization? Once those cues become powerful and I respond to them, how long does that last in my brain? Right? It can last a lifetime. So I presented the same data to a group of diabetologists, the docs who study diabetes. And what do you think their conclusion was? What do you think they said after they saw these data? And they saw this way of thinking about food. What was their conclusion? We're toast as a country. Because you lay down, you put fat, sugar, and salt on every corner, you expose the population. Not everybody is equally sensitive, right? Who is that pilot, I mean, for example, who landed the plane on the Hudson River? What was his name? Sully, right? So Sully, you put me up there, and I'm flying this plane, and I lose both engines, and I go, holy, what, Here's a guy, who loses both engines and says, no problem, I'm just going to land this plane. Right? So my emotional reactivity was what? Right? His was, right. Now, why was his lower? Was that something he was born with? Or was he trained? Right? So where does that get laid down? What's been the greatest, what do you think, certainly in our lifetimes, what's the greatest public health success? Smoking. What happened? It became unacceptable. So if you go to work at Philip Morris every day, what was the one thing you monitored more than anything else? What was the one number you looked at? What? Teen smoking? What was the one thing in the Gallup poll you looked at on smoking? What did you want to know? How young they started? They certainly wanted to know that. But what was the big number they wanted to know? The attitude. They wanted to know, leave it to the dean, right? They wanted to know the social acceptability. Did we change the cigarette? The design of the cigarette? No, but we changed what psychologists call the valence. Certainly in my parents' and grandparents' generation, as I said, smoking was cool. It was, right? It was positively valence. So we did what? When I was in this town and head of the agency, Mike Perchik was the head of the FTC, took me for breakfast one morning and said, our job is to demonize the tobacco industry. I said, what are you talking about? Well, I'm a federal official. I'm not supposed to demonize an industry. But he knew what we had to do was to change the valence. From positively valence, smoking is my friend, it's something I want, it's something I need, because if you're positively valenced, I'm going to approach you. If you're negatively valenced, I'm going to do what? I'm going to stay away. So what did we do? We changed the social norm from positive to negative, where smoking is, seen for what it is, a deadly, disgusting habit. So we changed that valence. Can you do that? I mean, what are we going to do? I mean, tobacco was easy. Why is tobacco easy? You don't need it, right? Food, you can't demonize. Food has to be pleasurable. So what are we going to do? Any doubt among all of you that this is a big issue? 2030 CDC, what, a third of us are going to be diabetics? I mean, wherever you are on the health reform spectrum, whatever your politics are, I think we can all agree that if a third of us are going to become diabetics, we're not going to be able to afford that. So you now have in front of you one of the great, any doubts, one of the great public health challenges? That's not an overstatement?
Not at all.
And what is the rest of the world saying about us when they come over here? They go, we don't want to look like them. And who's them? Us. Right? Interesting, the Canadians up until, always they admired us. They would come into our supermarkets and they'd go, there's 73 different types of cereals. They only had maybe a dozen. Right? They didn't eat out as much. Right? They ate locally. They didn't eat in restaurants. And now you see they have certain advantages. Right? What are we going to do? Can we tackle this? Do we need to tackle this? Okay. So do we have agreement on that? Let's see in the last 2 minutes if we can agree on what the legitimate role of government is when it comes to this. All right? See if we can have a consensus here. How many of you think that there's a legitimate role of government in assuring what's on the food label? Raise your hands. So we have about, 90%? There's agreement. So there's a legitimate role of government on the food label. What about in school lunch programs? Does government have a role for assuring that kids have nutritional education? Again, about 90%. What about deciding as a policy matter what we're going to subsidize and we use tax dollars for or not? Is that a legitimate role? Okay. What about taxing soft drinks? How many think we should tax soft drinks? It's about 60%. So that's sort of the break line. Right? What do you think? What are we going to have to do in order to change this? What is this going to come down to? Regulation? Is that the answer? What? Education? Is it? You're going to lecture me? You're going to tell me what works? This involves what? Not just education. This involves what? It's not just the cognitive centers of my brain. This has to do with what centers of the brain? The emotional core of the brain.
Science will have to figure out how to make
What do we have to do?
desirable. Figure out how to
Make carrots desirable? Or we have to change what we want, right? We have to change social norms. Dr. Gomes, why don't we open it up for a couple of questions? 'Cause I know people have to leave.
So, David, the government actually subsidized the production of tobacco at one time, as you know, and currently does subsidize the production of both sugar to various things, making water cheap, where they grow sugar cane, and corn, through the corn subsidy. And so corn, sugar, and sucrose are cheaper
Than real foods.
government subsidy.
So
Tobacco,
so that's a matter of government policy.
it is. I mean, government already has a policy.
Feel free to leave. I know we're at the end. We'll just take some more questions. Other comments?
How can you uncouple the role of physical activity and the fact that we've designed our life, we've engineered physical activity? Uncouple those two.
Right. So is physical activity the key here?
Personally, I think so.
Okay. So how long will it take me to eat a candy bar? 300 calories. How fast can I?
I'm talking physiologically.
Let's talk about physical activity to see if we get it right. Physical activity, how long will it take me to eat a candy bar?
It takes like 20 seconds.
20 seconds. How long will it take you to work off the calories of that candy bar? What? To exercise to work off the 300 calories? 30 minutes. So there's an imbalance, right? But what is exercise? Exercise, in essence, is a very effective reward, right? So if I feel good, it can change how I feel. So there's a lot of benefits from exercise, but it's not going to, let's make no mistake, the current obesity is a result of energy in. That's what's changed. But if you control, okay, if you really look cross-culturally, right? Happy to do that. Let's take one or two last questions.
Do you think that the difference between the lean people and the obese people in your study in their brains was conditioned when they were babies by some difference in the maternal diet? Or the
So what do you think? What's the greatest gift you could give somebody, you think? What's the greatest gift you can give someone over a lifetime? Is there a way you can immunize these circuits, right? And the answer is we don't have the data. I don't think we know, but it would be great if we could find a set of practices that we know that if you lay down early, that will help protect. My guess is the answer is yes. My guess is this happens in the early years of eating when kids shift to regular food, which is earlier and earlier, right? And that's when you sensitize. But if we use food as reward early on, we're going to continue to use food as reward. So the question is, can we substitute other rewards and good foods? Can they serve as rewards?
But is there a difference between infants that are breastfed for a long period versus infants that started on solid foods early?
You certainly do have certain correlations with BMI and breastfeeding. Two last questions.
If the USDA is already regulating the food in schools, what can be done so that the food is of better quality?
Yeah, so there's a lot of work being done on this. And I have to, I tip my hat. I think the USDA, I think Mrs. Obama, really pitch perfect. I think they really are trying very hard. Again, very hard, limited budgets, even for breakfast and other things. We're still not there. But for the first time in our lifetime, I think people are starting to pay attention. And you see what it really takes is that local, it's either that school official or that local cook in that cafeteria or a group of parents really wanting to take local control and care about it. Last question.
So when you said the comment about food says they don't want to look like us, and in the book you said something about how when some traditional foods from places come over, and you said that they're Americanized, what feelings do you think the people who created those dishes have towards them Americanizing their foods and filling it with fat and sugar?
Great question. How would you answer? What do you think?
I think they wouldn't feel okay with it because you gave us an example about how the creator of General Tso chicken, his dish wasn't meant to be sweet, but once it came over, it became extremely sweet.
Right. Go in. You're exactly right. And thanks for reading it. Go into. We have probably the sweetest diet in anywhere in the world. Right? Chinese food that's served here bears very little resemblance to Chinese food that's served natively. In China, it's adapted, and because they want to play. Now, what does that mean? If you can change the palate one way over time, does that mean the palate, our appetite is adaptable? Right? And can you change it? Right? Do you think we're going to be able to change this environment? How many of you are optimistic? Let me give you, Mrs. Knapp.
I'm optimistic only because of the change in smoking. That when I was growing up, smoking was everywhere, and I never could conceive that it would even be banned in bars. And there's just whole sea change that's happened. So I'm hoping that the same thing can happen with our food industry. And
What is it going to take?
changing our desires, no, our acceptance.
What is it?
Public's acceptance
What's it
of-
going to take? Who's going to have to do this? Everyone, right? We're going to have to care about it. It's not just lecturing people. It's not just about knowing. This is at the emotional level. Last word.
And I think for the young population, how you said how they stop, it was the word you used, how once they reach age 4 to 5, they start
Compensating.
compensating for their food. I think it also starts in the household because the parents set down the food regulations and what they feed their child, and I think that honestly starts for the young population.
Does government have a role? People think government has a role? Does food industry have a role?
Yes.
Right. Do we have roles as parents and as individuals? Is this can we tackle this? Right. Who's this going to take? I mean, so I agree with you. You know, when I came to FDA last year, there was a young person who worked at the agency. He was 29 years of age, and he came to me and said, "Commissioner, I think you should regulate tobacco." What do you think my reaction was? Can't be done. That was what I thought personally. Right? I thought, what do you think I really thought to myself when he raised it? I said, you must be crazy. So that really has stuck with me. Sometimes, just sometimes, what seems impossible can happen. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you very much.